Hola, ¿qué tal? Soy Ale, soy de Berlín. Sé hablar castellano, pero voy a dar la charla hoy en inglés porque no es mi idioma, no es mi lengua maternal. Bueno, about me. These are my credentials, how you can find me, how you can stalk me. Twitter, GitHub, all the usual stuff. Excuse me for the blog, but the rest is fairly actual. So, what do I do? Well, what I'm going to talk about today is some work that I did for a previous employer. They did actually give me permission to talk about it, so I hope they won't mind 6 months later. But where I'm working now, I'm working with a guy called Pedro Vicintin that many of you may know from the community here. What we do is we are developing a platform for prepaid Visa cards. This is the first time I've ever done anything in the financial services industry. I figure with the financial crisis of 2008, it's a perfect time to be in the financial services industry. But we are trying to disrupt this industry, so we sell prepaid cards. We're not giving credit, we're letting people charge up their own cards. So that's what I do. What I work on in my spare time, well, I'm probably best known for a library, an ORM library called DataMapper. I've worked on a few other things. I've patched a few of Luis's projects, for example, but Norman Clark's projects. I've done some work on Refinery CMS. You probably won't have heard of me, but I hope you remember me tonight or tomorrow or this time next year. So it's already been mentioned, I live in Berlin. This talk, there won't be any management speak, but it is quite a high-level talk. It's not very code-oriented. It's might be a little philosophical. What brings me to want to talk in that way? Well, I, like many Rubyists out there, have come to Ruby through quite an unorthodox path. Although I've been programming for, 2 decades, my background is actually in the humanities and in linguistics. That's what I've graduated in. Does that make me a good coder? I don't know. I'm decent. I'm not the best coder here. We have tender love here. Need I say more? But what I really like, and what I like in the Ruby community, is these different backgrounds give a huge amount of variety and give a huge number of different perspectives to what we develop. We're not the archetypal geeks. Maybe we do enjoy doing some of those activities, but there's quite a richness in this community that you don't find, say, in the Java world. So I wanted to start today with doing a little survey about preferences. What do we love to work with? Well, as Rubyists, we're actually quite strongly opinionated, I think. Dynamic languages now are attracting some of the best developers out there, and Ruby is no exception. So be it Python, be it Ruby, be it Dart, no. Go, no. Go is statically typed, right? Good developers are characterized by good choices. So this is all good, right? We don't accept fodder frameworks. We don't just accept what everyone else is doing out there. We're not sheep. We're not having it handed down to us by software architects, for example. As Rubyists, we really like to go out there and look for what's fresh, for what's the best out there. And one of the things that's really important about Ruby is that the people that are writing the frameworks, the people that write Rails, are the people that are also using those frameworks. I don't think that's the case if you use, say, Spring MVC or something along those lines. So this is just a random list of technologies. You will have your favorite. We have You should shout out what's your favorite technology, what really makes you want to get up in the morning and use Ruby or JavaScript. Our development environments, the same way, we feel really passionate about them. And our tastes extend strongly to our environment. Our desktop, it's the place we occupy for days and days on end, hours each day. So we all have our preferences, Luis as well. What I wanted to talk about is the fallacy of choice. Sometimes choice is not such a good thing. And wasn't Rails about the fact that we had this proliferation of Java frameworks, be it JSF or be it struts and all of this crap, and we wanted something simple. We wanted to be able to just go with it and to take and something that would address the 80% of use cases. Just to do templating, for example, in the Ruby world. Just a few choices out there. There are more. I'm sure I've left something off there. No. So this whole equation, this whole dynamic richness of the community causes this proliferation of different technologies, but at the same time, it just also increases complexity. So to get to the real core of what I wanted to talk today, to you all about today is constraints. Not restraints, but constraints. There is a certain beauty to constraints. They never come alone. They form a product. They're there between the coder and the final goal. There's something that comes into the path, impeaching the coder to make the code work. And constraints, let's move over for a moment to some philosophy. And there are two real ways of thinking about freedom. And the ways of thinking about freedom have run for a very long time, let's say 2,000 years. It's the basis of Western civilization. So I could talk for this for about hours, but my knowledge doesn't extend that far. It doesn't extend more than 5 minutes, actually. But, but there are some well thought out antagonist positions on this subject. There is something called positive freedom, and there is something called negative freedom. Positive freedom is where freedom is achieved when the subject grasps the good, when you get the code running without errors, you're happy. There's a great freedom in this. You're free to go home. You've done it. You've written your app. It runs. Maybe the tests run if you've done TDD. But you've only had a few choices. Maybe this is the Rails path. You know, you've gone with the defaults. You're using ERB. You're using Rails. You're using all of the defaults. You've had a few choices. You haven't really gone outside the box, but you've produced something of quality. This is what we would call a positive freedom. Then we can talk about negative freedom. This is freedom from all constraints. This is saying, well, maybe I'm going to develop a rack application and develop my application from scratch. Here, not only does the coder get the code working, but if he's clever enough, he will make sure that the code is worthy of something more than that. So the choices look tempting, but at the end, they all lack quality. So there's this cartoon here of The Simpsons, and unfortunately it's cut off a little bit because there's this address bar up here. So what it is it's the Simpson characters eating ice cream. And Bart, I think, asks, well, what flavor is your ice cream? And Milhouse replies, green, and yours. Maybe it's the same thing, you go to Starbucks or something, and there's this proliferation of choices, but when the end result is that you're caffeinated or you've had sugar put into you. is there really a freedom there, and that you've been able to choose from 20 to the power of, I don't know, hundreds of different choices, when the result is the same? Is that real freedom? So currently, even if we're working for companies, we have quite a strong autonomy as Rubyists. We'd like to, even maybe perhaps we're not freelancers, we can act like freelancers. We're in demand, so we can turn up late. I mean, I sure as hell do. I set my own hours some of the time before I get my wrist slapped. But companies and clients still do have different requirements. And companies do spend a lot of time investing in particular technologies that the geek before said was a good choice. So we know that at times we have to be pragmatic. To sum up, positive freedom, someone else dictating what is good or not. Negative freedom, to lose time, efforts, perhaps getting nothing worthy in return. Or perhaps actually getting something worthy in return, like DHH when he started Rails in 2005. And there are some other examples in the real life. For example, in the political world, dictators stumbling, falling because people are asking for their rights to get into politics. And the second example is, many of you may know this short story called Superiority by Arthur C. Clarke. And it's about just to summarize, it's about a captured general telling a story from his prison cell, and it was written in 1951. And it gives the reasons why his side lost the war, even though they had superior technology. So you would think if you have superior technology, you're going to win the war. But according to him, the reason is pretty simple for losing. They got too caught up in trying to develop superior technology and lost touch with the basics. So the way has to be somewhere in the middle. We could always tend to code in technologies just when they appear, just what's hot. Rails 3.1.1, Rails 3.1.2, RC, whatever. I don't know if it's out yet. But we need to think about whether it's worthy. So at times, the motto, less choices and better quality, could be considered. So I've been confronted by one of these situations, and this is why I've come to talk about the quietly versatile Rubyist, the Rubyist that shuts up and gets out of trouble. So in startups, often you'll have a certain freedom of being able to choose all the technologies you want, be able to decide your stack. If you work for GitHub, where I'm working now, we pretty much have free reign. If we don't use too many EC2 instances, we can choose what technologies we want to work with. But I'm going to talk about doing work for an enterprise. Now, this is a case study, a story of a project I did about 6 months ago, it must be. It's of Bosch. They make dishwashers and they make drills, screws, all sorts of things. They make diesel engines. I'm sure you've heard of them. Their logo is everywhere around Buenos Aires as well. So we wanted to do, the company I was working for at the time, we wanted to create a website for their 150th birthday, the anniversary of Bosch. And we wanted to create an internal type of social network for them. So it sounds probably not that exciting. It's really something that thousands of people have tread this path before you. You know, you could probably download something that's already been created. It's not it's not revolutionary technology, it's content-y stuff. So we could just use an out-of-the-box CMS. However, we can be pragmatic, and we can be pragmatic. I'm still a Rubyist. We could hack the hell out of Drupal or Typo 3 or whatever. Typo 3 can be bent to do all sorts of things, content-y sites. It can be, Drupal can be bent to create whitehouse.gov. But we as Rubyists still prefer finely crafted tools. And I don't think anyone could describe as Drupal as a finely crafted tool. So we did want to roll our own thing. But this had to be hosted internally in this big enterprise. And there are a couple stacks that they support. PHP, .NET, Java. So I'll just walk through these really quickly. So .NET redeeming feature, I'm sorry I forgot to finish this slide, but .NET is a great choice, I'm sure, for some things. PHP has this, it's everywhere. Yeah, okay, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. A true pragmatist probably should keep PHP in their toolbox. You probably do want to use WordPress for many things. It's certainly capable of powering major sites. Just ask Facebook. But I don't like it. I don't like working with it. The language has major limitations. I feel that whenever you write structured PHP, if you take a framework like Symfony, some sort of clone of Rails, the code ends, if you end up writing this really structured code, it ends up looking like Java anyway, in which case, why don't you just write Java and use the JVM? Be more secure. So Java, yeah, well, certainly not going there. Or really? Well, maybe. So I'm not gonna, this is not the JRuby talk, but I really love the JVM, and I implore you to also give it some love. It's a super platform for applications, and we can exploit it to run all sorts of things. It's just a matter of using JRuby Rack and compiling all of your application, compiling it or bundling it up into a WAR file. So in theory, to make your Rails application use JRuby, you can gem install Warbler, and you can warble. And you might need to change in your database.yaml, you might need to change the driver that you're using. Is anyone here using JRuby at all in production? Not very many, okay. Except unfortunately our constraints went further. So one constraint was, when we took on the project, we thought we would have a choice of application server. We actually thought we'd be using JBoss, and JBoss has an integration out there that's called TalkBox, and we could have taken advantage of that straight away, and it can integrate with all sorts of pre-existing technologies. But the choice was actually WebSphere, IBM WebSphere. I Googled for documentation. I pulled my hair out. I'd already agreed to take on this project and to do it this way, and to develop roll our own in-house content management system. There's almost no documentation. I think there are two, if you search for it now, there are 2 articles that really matter, but they're both about 3 years old. But it kind of, so the next constraint was IBM WebSphere comes with its own JDK. So it's not the same JDK that you have on your Mac. This is the IBM J9 runtime. For those, so those who've had the pleasure of working with enterprise Java servers will know that there's more than one Java runtime out there. And unfortunately, there was a regression somewhere with JRuby between 1.56 and 1.60 that stopped JRuby running at all. And It turned out there were some problems with class name mangling because JRuby will generate, internally at least, JVM classes, and despite it being in the spec for a JVM, it turns out that some JVM will accept a hash as a class name, as a method name, rather, and the IBM JVM will not. It's not a valid identifier. So the next challenge, I personally chose Data Mapper since that's what I'm involved in, but there were some issues there. There were a couple of bugs that had to be worked through. One thing that was really interesting was that IBM WebSphere and Oracle have their own built-in integration, and they actually proxy the JDBC classes, and so there were all sorts of issues using class for name and then the class not being there. So we ended up actually having to roll our own database driver. We had no file system access, and this was difficult with user-uploaded content. We're trying to create a social network of some sort. Rack static is great. I would implore you to use rack static. We are using rack static here for serving from random areas of the file system that IBM WebSphere we cannot configure it to serve up the files correctly. So we were serving videos with rack static. Turned out far easier than trying to instruct technical staff to configure IBM WebSphere. Logging. If we had had more time and budget, then we would have written logs back to the database and presented some UI for them. We didn't do this in the end, so we had to get occasional dumps from technical staff at over at Bosch. This is not ideal either, but particularly for performance reasons, but that was something we considered doing. Okay, so just to summarize, lessons learned. Well, this project taught me to be versatile. The challenges of having to use a technology you don't like, you don't want to use. Most of you won't ever want to use WebSphere, but maybe some of you have had, and maybe some of you have fled to Ruby for that very reason. Where am I now? Well, I'm a hypocrite because now I can choose the technologies I want to do. But I have to say, there's part of me that kind of liked having the constraint. It's an open world out there. It's quite scary being able to pick whatever technologies I want to use. So high-level conclusions. Well, if I've done a bad job explaining myself if versatility comes across as use JRuby. JRuby was just one particular example. That's just this particular story that I wanted to tell. But you could do a lot worse than picking JRuby. It is a pragmatic technology choice, in my opinion. Embrace constraints. If you're clever, it will come. Focus on your goals. You can do amazing things with these awful, awful technologies. Low-level conclusions, keep some stuff in your toolbox. Not just Rails, but of course learn the standard lib. But really learn Sinatra, learn Tilt, learn rack static. Those things have saved me numerous times. Active support is great. Any more, you probably have your own, but take some effort to learn some of the more low-level libraries, and you will do well even in the most difficult and constrained situations. So thank you very much to the following: WordGraphy, my partner in crime; pvisitin, my partner at work and my company. This presentation is available online, and any questions are most welcome.
Yes.
En castellano, sí, está bien.
¿Hay alguna forma de, digamos, cuando todas las opciones están disponibles.
Sí.
¿Pensás que hay alguna forma de limitarte a vos mismo como para encontrar, digamos, sacar ventaja de esta filosofía de que acabas de hablar? No sé, decir, bueno, por ejemplo, elegir JRuby podría ser una forma de limitarte a opciones que se pueden usar.
Diría que si uno está acostumbrado o apurado con un proyecto, está mejor usar algo que ya has usado. Entonces, si uno conoce Rails, usa Rails. Depende si quieres tomar un riesgo o no.
You spoke about the constraints of choosing the right platforms given like the constraints you had at Bosch, but obviously you're not there anymore to do the support. Was that some consideration they had also? Because the stack you've chose, are there still people at Bosch able to do the support and the maintenance of your application?
That is a really good question. Whether there are people internally, no, there are not. They've been handed, but the way the project was organized was that it was something that would be delivered almost like an appliance. So we would have to hand it off, and so they would have to get that expertise back in. It seems like a pretty horrible situation to deliver something that way, but that's the way the contracts were written. I was working for an agency that was very much design-oriented, and they like to have projects that come to a close and they stop there, and there was no support contract for it. So yeah, that's how it was delivered. They do run other JVM languages there, Groovy, I've seen a lot of. So they do have some experience of it, but it was a learning curve for both of us.
Just real quick, I wanted to know your thoughts on JRuby and why you're such a huge fan, given there's definitely a lot of different options these days, but I'm just curious if you can sum up just really quickly why you're such a big fan of JRuby.
Because it lets you integrate technologies that have been out that are tried and trusted and that we shouldn't necessarily throw away. So that would be my answer. There are good applications for it when you want to do stuff with threading, which MRI doesn't do very well. There are some performance benefits, but you'd have to test that yourself. It will depend on the application, the type of request, the HTTP request that you're serving up. I like it because of the ability to, and my reason for coming to it is the ability to integrate into with pre-existing libraries. And what I like most about it is it's a way of slipping Ruby into places that you wouldn't normally be able to get Ruby, like a big enterprise, like Bosch. That's not the place you think of actually running a Ruby on Rails application. Gracias.